From a finance and IT background, many years as controller, chief financial officer within technology companies, and spent a lot of time around this cloud issue. Sophia, I won't even begin to pronounce her last name. Sophia, who comes out of Symantec, where she was chief of staff for the CIO there, and has also spent a lot of time helping companies understand the business value of technology and this transformation that we're in. As well as Justin Somaini,
Sure.
close to that, with Box, who is one of our sponsors for today. And Box is a cloud platform provider. And Justin is in the role of Chief Trust Officer in helping companies and organizations build trust and security for data that is stored in the cloud. Before we jump in, though, I would like to ask a question. How many people here are working in a company that provides a product of some nature? It could be a software product, it could be a gadget, it could be shoes, but something that is a product, a tangible product that's sold. Okay.
You say tangible?
Yeah, some tangible. Yeah. How many are working in a company that provides a service? Okay. And how many are here because K&L does great lunches? Excellent. Of all of the organizations that we partner with for events, the K&L Gates is absolutely the best on location and logistics and lunch. So our topic today really is around getting some definition, getting some structure, and helping people from different perspectives understand what cloud means. And as I mentioned, we've got a lot of different backgrounds and perspectives to that question. But the first one that I'd like to throw out to start with is just setting a stage of where did this come from all of a sudden? If you think back 5-6 years ago, how many of us were talking about cloud? Other than the thing in the sky. a few. But even 10 years ago, this was a novel concept. And then suddenly there was a company called Salesforce.com that came out with this, what sounded to be kind of a strange idea, that they would sell software that people could access their database, and their database sat somewhere in a cloud. It was kind of a brilliant strategy because at that time, things like customer databases and CRMs were these complex, difficult, hard to implement. So they had a great strategy of sell to people that need access to data, do it easy, and store it somewhere else. And that began to catch on, and things have grown to where this is probably the #1 topic that many of us in businesses and certainly around IT are grappling with today of what do I do about cloud? So a few other dynamics have changed in the market other than Salesforce having a great run and a great ride. And a number of dynamics that you can look at from the point of view of technology has evolved, such that this is a big topic today. But there's also a piece where people have evolved, and the way people go about doing business and the way people look at things has also evolved. So one of the things that I'd like to throw out there as we all think about why transform and do something about cloud is there's a lot of trends and drivers that are happening in the marketplace that's bringing this to fruition today. Number one, there's different generations coming into the world. This doesn't actually show on the screen, it shows on the wall. Okay. There's new generations, the millennials, the younger people coming into the workforce, and those of us that have worked with them recognize they kind of have a different mindset. They want to do things their own way. And they grew up on technology. So when they take a job at a company, they're not like those of us 30 years ago in our first job walked in and said, tell me where you want me to sit, what kind of tools do you want me to have, and give them to me. The millennial today comes in saying, Tell me what you want me to achieve. I've got my iPad, I've got my iPhone, I know what I like to do and what I like to use to get my challenges taken care of. Just tell me what you want me to do. So that, one could say, is driving this trend that we see in IT that's called BYOD. Does anybody know what that means?
Yeah.
What does it mean?
Bring your own device.
Bring your own device. Come into the workplace with what you want to use. It's set up to the workplace to equip you so that you can use your device around that environment, which is a big challenge for IT organizations that like to kind of know what's connecting to their network and they like to control it. So that's one of the dynamics behind this whole cloud piece. Another human side of it is, kind of plays to the millennials and bring your own device, is that thanks to social media, where any of us can go online and post our opinion about anything, there is a general trend towards consumerization. That the consumer and the user is what is creating the demand and the interest and controlling where things are going. So this desire to do what I want, when I want, how I want, tell everybody about it, is also kind of driving that, well, let me try it in a short term before I actually commit to it. Anybody seeing that in their companies or in their lives? The desire to not commit for long-term use of this same device. But if I try the iPhone and I don't like it, in a month I can end my contract and I can go to the Samsung. That short-term mindset in the corporation really ties to more of a mindset of I want to pay for things with operating expense, OPEX, versus capital expense, because it's a shorter term commitment. So all of those dynamics are really driving the need from a technology point of view, a need for technology to be quick and easy to implement, quick and easy to unimplement if you don't like it, purchased on operating expenses, simple, something that people can individually choose and use, and able to change very quickly. The need for agility in the workplace and quick changes is also a big part behind that. Yeah.
Yeah, just to highlight what you're saying, vendors can be competitive in many categories. We're in cloud telephony.
Mm-hmm.
You really have to offer a trial kind of program.
Yep.
That doesn't mean a full implementation or full rollout, which is
Yep.
more difficult, of course, and more committed. So doing a micro or a targeted trial,
Yep.
And how to do that and still get a full test done is often a challenge for any application.
That's a very, very good point. The smaller increment you can put in front of someone for them to make a decision to try it, the better. But the other piece that you're struggling with, it sounds like, is customer experience is more important than ever. Because if in that first little trial they aren't delightedly happy, they're going to jump on Facebook and tell everybody that this didn't work and they're not going to come back. So it's kind of competing demands that are driving a lot of this. Very, very good point. So the world is changing, and so if you haven't thought about potentially implementing technologies that are as a service and leveraging the cloud, i.e. the ability to store things somewhere else other than in your resident device, probably need to think about it because that is happening around you. But there's a lot of challenges and implications around that, depending upon where you sit, so to speak. And we could spend all day on this, so I'll just kind of quickly point out that if you are in a company that is providing a product today, whether it's software, gadgets, or cars, you might be thinking, how can I package what I do and what I'm providing, that tangible product, to as a service? Because if you can make it available as a service, you may have a broader market of people that are willing to adopt things in that way than if it's only to purchase it as a product. I mentioned car. Look at how much Zipcar and some of their competitors have grown. That is an automobile as a service, basically. Quick, simple, easy to implement. But if you're in one of those companies, so you're up here in this top quadrant of the vendor, it's not easy. I mentioned we worked with Adobe to go from Creative Suites of packaged software to Creative Cloud. That was a 2 to 4 year journey from the time of Adobe saying, we're going to do this, to where today all sales of Creative Suites products are as a service. That's about a 4 year window. And a lot of critical strategic decisions need to be made to do that right. And there's a lot of risk in doing that incorrectly. If you are not a vendor, but you're providing a service of selling products through some form of a channel, and that could be a VAR or a reseller, it could be distribution, there's a lot of implications there. Because that software, if we take Adobe, that software historically would be sold through, maybe it's Fry's or Best Buy or CDW or Joe's Bar that sells all technology in Oklahoma. And what they did in the past was they took that box of software from Adobe and they would package some services around it and other things and then sell it to the end customer. Well, if that box is no longer there and the end customer can access that software directly from Adobe, what is their role? The real big question for a lot of the distribution and the resellers. And a lot of things that they can do to differentiate themselves, but they need to look at things differently and answer that question of how cloud can help them as opposed to hurt them. Similarly, if someone's in the IT department in a company and has been responsible for all of the devices and all of the technology in that company, their role is changing now too, because their internal client, i.e. the employees, they no longer need IT to provide them devices. They're bringing their own device when they come in. So the nature and the role of IT is changing dramatically. And that's one that you'll hear a bit from Rich and Sophia on what that really looks like, as well as Justin, because they play a big role in security. And similarly, for any of you in organizations, you can be certain that people in your organization are asking that question of how can we implement the right cloud technology? Where do we want to buy as a service versus the big capital investment? And very importantly, how do we protect our data if we store it in the cloud? If we outsource all of our infrastructure and our telephony, how do we know that when we pick up the phone it's going to work? So a lot of questions around compliance, security, reliability. And again, that will be areas that Justin and each of us can talk to. Make sense? So I've kind of thrown out that word cloud and added a little bit around what's kind of driving this, but I want to turn to Sophia and ask her to give us a little bit of perspective from a IT executive point of view for many years. What is cloud and where is this thing really going?
Excellent. Thank you. Let me start by asking you. Every one of you, I suspect, has heard about cloud, but what do you think it is? Do you think people know? And according to a recent study, over 35% of people asked did not know what cloud meant. They admitted they really didn't quite understand it. So if you're a little bit puzzled by all of the differing information that you've heard, you're not alone. I suspect the number's probably bigger if we asked for a deep dive and we went outside the technology industry and asked the question. I've put up a definition here from the National Institute of Standards and Technology because I think that's probably the best answer there is right now. And like most technology answers, it's evolving. I think all of you have heard of software as a service. and infrastructure as a service, and now there's everything as a service. I mean, everybody, every day is coming up with a new acronym for some sort of service offering. So as things evolve, we're going to see this change. And one of the ways it's going to change is in adoption. I mean, it's really shocking almost how fast cloud is growing. Between 2011 and forecasted out to 2017, 3 times growth, multi-billion-dollar business. In fact, just this year, from 2013 to the end of 2014, the forecast from the experts who do this kind of thing is that it's going to grow by 20%. Who wouldn't want their business to have a piece of that 20% and take advantage? So you really want to ask, so why? Why? I mean, there's all this transformation going on, but why do I want to move to the cloud? What is the impact on business when we move to the cloud? So there's a lot of data up here. I want to talk about kind of big categories of information about why and what the implications are for businesses. And I think the first one is around the cost of entry. So if you were going into the IT business in the legacy days, which is very long ago, you would have needed a lot of money to put up a brick and mortar data center. You'd have to buy, and I mean buy, all of this hardware. And then you'd have to populate it with all kinds of software. Today, the price of entry is a subscription. If you talk to a cloud service provider, whether it's an infrastructure as a service, a platform as a service, or software as a service, you can get a subscription model. You can get a pay-for-use model. And what that tends to mean to all of us is that smaller players with great ideas can now compete with the big guys, because you don't have to come up with that initial capital that you would have to in legacy days. So one of the big implications of cloud is that it, to some degree, levels the playing field a bit for the services you want to offer. So that I think is really, really important. The other thing I think that resonates on that same topic is that it allows you to almost rent, not own. And if you think about it, and you think about what Jennifer talked about, how people are wrapping services into their business, whatever it is, we're seeing a trend towards something that is frankly being studied very heavily in Europe, less so in the States, although we're doing it. And that's this notion of servitization. Often you'll see it spelled in the States as servicization. And there's a company that you probably all know called Rolls-Royce. Do any of you know what it would take to buy a jet engine from Rolls-Royce?
About $15 million.
You know what? You could double that number and you couldn't buy it. They no longer sell jet engines. Much to my amazement, when I was doing some research, they have a pay-for-use model for those engines. And in that model, they have wrapped all the services that go with it. So the maintenance, everything, because they've actually put a lot of technology beyond the engine technology into this magical service that they offer their customers. So you as a customer have the advantage, if you're talking to Rolls-Royce for your jet engine, you have the advantage of negotiating with them and making sure that you're going to be able to just rent for the use you have when you need it. So it changes that whole paradigm. And I think in the States, we're not studying it because it is so pervasive. I mean, go to your local Nordstrom's, and in many, many of those stores, you don't have to go to the cash register. They all come to you with an iPad, and you give them your card. You don't have to take a paper receipt home. It'll show up just like it does when you buy something at the Apple store. You can have a receipt if you want it, but it's much easier to just have them email it to you. So it's invading our lives in a way that we're just beginning to imagine. And that kind of change in perspective is also going global. We are not the only ones who are doing this. I was recently talking to a small company in India, and they now have an app, and who hasn't heard there's an app for that, right? That's something we never heard 10 years ago, but we all know about it. There's an app for just about everything. This small company has software that when I walk through the mall, all of the stores can send me a message on my mobile device that tells me where the sales are. So I can get 20% off from this store or that store. And those are the kinds of business and service changes that we can expect. Who here uses Comcast? Okay. How many of us know that they've just changed their business model substantially? They are adding, and we see it on TV commercials, they are adding the security for your home. And it's software, it's a new service. Who would have imagined that my cable provider was going to do that? I think we can all look forward to lots more of that kind of business transformation, because if you read the news the other day, Comcast and Apple are talking about doing some business together. So the whole television industry is yet again going to go through, I suspect, another change. And that is kind of the business transformation that is going on around us, and it ought to make all of us think about how we deliver our products and our services, because it's not going to be exactly the same 5 years from now. It probably won't even be the same 3 years from now. And I say that because if you were back in the capital expense days and you were building a data center, it would take you months and years, and you would have to raise the money and do the building and buy the equipment. Today, you can go to a cloud service provider, pick what model fits your business the best, and be up and running literally in months. Now, it doesn't mean you haven't had to plan and you haven't had to change your strategies in the course of what are your business processes, because they're going to change. How do you deal with your customers? That's going to change, because your relationship with them, where it might have been eyeball to eyeball, now it's probably going to be online. Your customers are going to want to do self-service reporting. Right now, when I get my PG&E bill, I can see what my usage is. Tomorrow, I ought to be able to go in and log on and see it. And those changes will impact all of us. So with that, I want to ask Rich to talk a little bit about the financial background behind some of this.
Just a quick clarification, Sophia. Is it fair to say that the rise of apps and the mobility is partly driven by the ability to store things in the cloud, which makes it cheaper and easier for people to create these?
A great lead-in question for Rich, and the answer is yes, because of the subscription model and the pay-for-use model. So if you do business with a cloud service provider, you're going to see different rates for when you use data and another rate when you just store it and it's sitting there static without interaction. Rich,
All right.
comment on that?
Sure, I mean, that's kind of what I was going to talk about. So, as a reminder, I'm the finance guy here. But I have spent actually the last more than 30 years of my career working in the computer industry. And I've been through a number of compute scenario changes. I started way back in the day when they had mainframes, went to client server. There have been a number of compute scenario shifts. And I think really cloud computing is the latest shift that we're dealing with. And there's an interesting survey that we were able to get, and actually Sophia gave me the survey. So despite the fact that cost is number one on the survey, this is not the survey that I got, although I'm loving the results of the survey. But I would think if you just, if we talk around the room, I think most people would agree that the common perception is that going to the cloud will help reduce cost. And I think you see that in the first two responses, because it's not only reduced cost, but it's also increased efficiency and to some extent faster deployment time. Now, over the years, I've really wrestled with faster deployment time. I can guarantee you that with the cloud, you can get much faster deployment time. I mean, for years and years, I wrestled with building infrastructure, data center infrastructure in companies, and that takes quite a while to do, to stand up the servers, get the operating systems loaded, get the applications up and running, and then tune those applications to your specific solution. With the cloud, you can go out and basically, if you pick the right cloud provider, you can get that immediately. Now remember, there's a couple different types of cloud providers. There are cloud infrastructure providers, which gives you just basically the infrastructure upon which you could build your application or your service. But there's other cloud providers that come automatically with the application. Like Salesforce.com would be a great example of that, right? So you can go in and get the application right away and not even have to build that application. So when I was at Symantec, there was a tremendous movement towards wanting to get to the cloud, not only for cost, but also for time to market. Now there's always two perspectives of the cloud, right? So you can be a cloud consumer, right? You can want to buy those cloud services, but you could also be a cloud provider where you want to provide those services as well. And the point I would leave you with on this slide is, even though I would tell you, and I'm not going to spend any time getting into why this is the case, but I will guarantee you the economics of the cloud compute scenario will provide reduced cost. It is not necessarily priced that way. So buyer beware in the marketplace. So when you're out shopping around for cloud providers, I would definitely competitively bid it, because even though their cost is probably lower, they do not necessarily have to pass that along to you. So be careful with that.
Richard, a question. When you say shopping around for cloud providers,
Right.
why would one be shopping for a cloud provider? What would it do for one?
Well, the space is already very competitive, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's just take software application as an example.
Okay.
For any particular function that the CIO might be trying, business process that we're trying to automate, there are probably already multiple cloud providers out there in that space. And I think there's two reasons, and you probably expect me to say price first, and okay, so maybe price would be first. But I think more importantly, and remember, fundamentally, the reason you have IT in the first place is to automate business process. So really what you want to do from your perspective as a consumer is looking for that cloud provider that most clearly mirrors your business process, right? Because the last thing you want to do is, once you're in the cloud, is have to modify that application to meet your business process, right? And there's many different business processes that work, many that work well. The one thing that you really ought to think about is, if you cannot find your business process out in the cloud, I think you really need to rethink your business process in your company, because there's a good chance that it's not best practices. So that is something really to consider as you're shopping around for the cloud. So I would say business process and price are the two things that you want to take a look at. And most reasonably sized companies have procurement organizations that can help prepare the RFQ. If you don't have a procurement organization, there are consultants that can certainly help you prepare an RFQ and RFI to get that type of information. So, and then that kind of leads in nicely. So any other questions on this? I'm going to leave the security to Justin here, who's going to follow me. But I think it's a nice follow-on to this. Like I had just mentioned, you really do want to consider the cloud as a faster way to get your business process up and running, and a lower cost alternative to deliver functionality. These are the steps you would typically go across in these chevrons. First, accept the notion that you're going to move from a traditional licensed-based approach to a cloud-based approach, because that can be a big paradigm to get over, but most people seem to actually get over that pretty quickly. But like I said, I think the important step here is spending the time to do the due diligence properly to get the right service provider. And then once you can do that, you can then apply this lower cost model to what this is down here. So this mess down here is what a CIO typically has to deal with in their day-to-day operations. And each one of these circles really represents both a business process, and an application, right? Because you've got the business process fundamentally, and then you've got the application that automates that business process. And there's a whole host of these things in any company. These are pretty much the common ones that you would find in any medium or large-sized company. Clearly, small-sized companies would have many of these business processes also. I think most of you recognize them, and there are a number of these. And then from a deployment model within the company, you've got the whole continuum that you can take a look at, which is a traditional licensed model, which would be either in-house hosting, or you can go to, to an outsourced provider and get the infrastructure outside, right? Or on the other end of that, and there's all models in between, you can go to the full SaaS cloud approach. And the thing I like about the SaaS cloud approach is that because it is lower cost, these budgets are typically constrained. I mean, you've typically got business process owners. I mean, anybody here who works in an IT organization knows that you've got business process owners that are continually wanting modifications, upgrades, version upgrades to the software, and that typically consumes the IT resource. And the one thing that I have always found true is that the demand for IT projects is always much greater than the availability of the IT budget. So when you're trying to solve that difficult business problem, I think the cloud is a great way to help solve that, because you can get more value and functionality for less money. And as the CIO and his finance guy are trying to figure out how you get all of this stuff done, the cloud is actually a great way to get more functionality at a lower cost and therefore much more value. Yes?
Rich, could you please just state what those acronyms are in the large circle there? I know ERP,
Sure.
but maybe all of them.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Some of them I'm not familiar with.
Okay, so so this enterprise resource planning system, right? Any enterprise resource planning system typically consists of three fundamental components: the customer-facing one, which is the quote to cash, right? So this is basically getting the price out there, doing the fulfillment, and getting the accounts receivable. You've got procure to pay. So this is as you're buying infrastructure within the company, dealing with vendors, right? Paying vendors. So going through the RFQ process, getting those purchase recs out there, and then getting the vendors paid. And this is procure to pay. And then you have record to report. So this is truly the financial ledger side. So this is maintaining the general ledger. So all of that accounting needs to get into the ledger and cost centers so that it can go into the SEC and the management reporting for the 10K reports. All of these things can be found in Oracle and SAP, which are the popular ones for mid-size and the large companies. And then there are ERP systems tailored specifically for some of the smaller companies as well. This tends to be extremely resource consuming. I have been through a number of very expensive ERP upgrade systems. Now I would tell you, my personal experience in this, the cloud is not mature enough. Although it is advertised, the cloud I don't think is mature enough to go and put this stuff out in the cloud. I think it's getting close though, and probably within the next 5 years we'll see that. I do believe SAP does have the capability, and Oracle has the capability to get it in the cloud, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that yet. So typically this would be buying the license and doing the configuration within your company. And then the last point on the configuration that I want to make, just again from a finance perspective, recognize there's an enormous difference between configuration and customization. Almost all software and cloud providers are going to provide some level of configuration, and that's very healthy to more closely meet your business process needs. When you start getting into customization, which is now well beyond configuration, and you're changing the code in the cloud provider or even in a licensed provider, that becomes a very expensive and time-consuming proposition, and significantly increases the total cost of ownership for IT applications.
A couple of questions, Rich.
Sure.
What, you had mentioned you wouldn't put this stuff in the cloud. Which stuff were you referring to? I couldn't quite
Oh, I'm
see.
sorry, the ERP I don't think is ready for prime time yet. I mean, if you think about it, that is really the hearts and lungs of your business. I mean, that is really the core critical application of your business. And I am not sure, I mean, in my company, I would not want to bet that on the cloud yet. Now, when I was at Symantec, the first thing that I recommended that we put out in the cloud was actually development. So think about software development and why that is ideally suited to the cloud. So when we used to have to build internal infrastructure for development, we used to have to build that infrastructure for peak capacity, which means systems test and integration. But over the life cycle of building a product, that system test and integration isn't necessarily a huge period of time in that development, yet you have to build your capacity to that level of investment, right? Where a lot of your time is actually spent in coding, right? Design, coding, and that type of work, which really doesn't consume that much computer storage capacity. So in the development environment, where you can take that out to the cloud and you pay for what you use, right? And so when you're using relatively little compute power in the development environment, so you can get by with a lower bill, but then when you have to burst up for your system test environment, that infrastructure can be quickly provisioned, you pay for what you use, and when you complete your system test, that ramps back down again, and your bill comes back down again, and you're not left with a lot of servers and storage that you're trying to sell on the used market after you use them. Yes, question?
Quickly on your comment on ERP, I think you're right that a lot of processes or setups cannot at this moment go in the cloud, but there's also views for customers, for employees on this data, for example, or on certain processes where you can twist it and also call it as a service or a pay-per-use on licenses for people who don't need to go in the deepest detail of a process of the ERP system, but just needs sort of view rights, right? So you can argue that the license models, or you don't even need a full ERP license for certain employees, but they can use a sort of a cloud license to just view certain data.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the data is the important point, though. So
Yeah.
when you go to the full ERP out in the cloud, your data is fully out there in the cloud. And on a business critical, like I said, on a business critical application like that, I am not there yet. Now, let me tell you though, where I would be there, right? So even at Symantec, we move HR out to the cloud, right? So the HR systems we put out in the cloud. Now, so there's a lot of privacy concerns there as well, right? And Justin can probably talk about some of the security aspects around that. But we took HR and put that out in the cloud. Somewhat business critical, but in my judgment, not nearly as business critical as this. I think one of the easier ones to put out in the cloud, and this is the one that Sophia and I are spending a lot of time looking at right now, is education. Right, so there's a lot of learning management systems out there, and already, I mean, Sophia and I have done some research. There are a lot of learning management systems out in the cloud already. So there's a lot of competition out there, and when you think about, learning management systems, I mean, the obvious thing everybody always thinks about is employees, but it's really not just for employees, it's for your customers, and it's also for your business partners. Because if you can train your customers better, they're going to be happier with your product, they're going to be more likely to buy more of your product, and it makes for an easier upsell. Similarly with partners, you get your partners better trained, you're going to get better loyalty from your partners, and they're going to be more effective in selling your product. So I think this LMS space is one that's primed to move to the cloud right away. I think the other one that everybody's seen out there is email out in the cloud. I mean, I think a lot of people might have Google accounts. I mean, fundamentally, that's really out there in the cloud already, right? But again, some privacy and security concerns around that, right? I mean, the businesses run these days by email. And the question is, do you want to put, the heart and lungs of your business and the email and all the information that's out there out in the cloud already? That's a judgment each business needs to make for itself. I think over the next 5 years, that'll be easier and easier for most businesses to make. And, I think most email facilities will be out in the cloud. Many of them, obviously, are out there already.
Perfect opportunity for Justin to share a bit of his view as to how we can keep security around.
Could you leave that slide though?
Yep.
Yeah, let me hit a couple of things. So to set the stage of security, and the basic premise of security is really something that's very, very simple. You take your content and your transactions and you apply confidentiality, integrity, and availability to it. It sounds very, very simplified, but when we start applying into various environments, it becomes very complex. But if you maintain your thoughts around your content and your transactions and how you protect it, it becomes a little bit easier to identify the things that you need to do, as well as the things that you should expect from those that you're handing it over into. However, when we talk about content and transactions, not all content and transactions are effectively the same value to every company. And so when you look at some of these things that we've historically outsourced in the past, i.e. cloudized, I'm going to coin that, we're really looking at back office functions, or G&A, or how we take our HR systems, how we take email, etc., and how we migrate those into a more cost-effective, agile, we're doing 300 releases of feature functionality of that product every year versus the one upgrade of SharePoint or the one upgrade of the Exchange servers. So as a result of that, you get a lot of capabilities for your employees. They're able to go off, they're able to do a lot of things more productive, more effective. But what we're seeing is that's really just the first step. And a lot of companies have realized that. A lot of companies are going into that pathway. It's a huge disruptor for smaller companies more than it is for the Fortune 100s of the world, because there's a lot of debt that those larger companies have to migrate. Instead of one Exchange server, for example, there's probably 100, so that switching cost is very problematic. But when we start to migrate away from some of these back office functions and start to realize the new information economy, we're starting to see cloud in a different form. We're starting to see IT actually driving the business decisions. And so when you look at GE or the Internet of Things, when we talk about the engines that are out there for Rolls-Royce, it's really the intelligence that are coming back from those devices that are enabling them to dramatically lower costs, dramatically identify the deficiency rate of a refrigerator, for example, so they can cut the release train of that new product or that new version of the refrigerator going out, and as a result of that, saving hundreds of millions of dollars, or maybe, and more dramatically, beating the market by 3, 4, 10 years with new features and capabilities. When you look at Netflix as a great example, everybody really thinks of them as the organization that publishes or mails out CDs, but really what they are today is not just a streaming service, what they are is an intelligence service. They know exactly who you are and what you like to watch, and as a result of that, they're able to craft new content such as House of Cards and be incredibly successful at it. And so when you look at each and every one of the businesses as it transforms in the future, technology and information is going to be the decider, not the supporter. And that is a huge shift, not only in regards to how businesses function, but also the value of that content and where you place it. And so when we look at actually cloud services and how we drive an analysis of it, and actually we'll probably go to the next slide. Thank you. I would probably put it in 3 different categories. Let's first break it up into what is the enrollment process, how do we look at cloud providers before we engage them, what is the management structure, how do we live with that cloud provider and things that we need to consider, and actually more importantly, God help us if we want to move off that cloud provider, what are the things that we need to consider as we do it. So when you talk about getting on board, and I've been a security guy for many, many years. I've been the CISO at Yahoo, CISO at Symantec. I was over at VeriSign, Schwab, and then I was one of those hateful auditors way, way back in the day. But I've been on both sides of this thing called cloud as a consumer of it, as well as a maintainer of the security of the cloud service. And what you really find for a lot of customers is that first and foremost, they don't know the real value of their content or their transactions that they're putting up there. And as a result of that, they don't understand what are the requirements or controls or liabilities or indemnities that they want to place on that cloud provider. And they don't know how to engage that conversation. And when you look at cloud utility or the cloud adoption over the past 10 years, it's heavily been driven by the business units, not necessarily by IT or the security organizations within it. Those organizations are playing catch up. How do we invoke or how do we inject our requirements into the procurement process that we have never been involved with before in order to identify the cloud provider, in order to drive the understanding of the sensitivity of the content. And as a result of that, place the appropriate controls on that cloud provider as we go into it. So the very first thing is know what the value is of the content or transactions that you're looking to share. And beyond that, how do you actually engage in a healthy dialogue with that cloud provider in a contractual phase? So there's a lot of things that normal customers will do, and as cloud providers, we've come to expect them. What are your certifications? We are going to be putting financial information up there. Are you ISO 27002 certified, which is an international standard for security management? Are you PCI certified for credit card information? Hey, we're going to put healthcare information up there. Do you have a HIPAA certification? These are things that should be commonplace today for cloud providers. If you see a question mark on the cloud provider's face, strongly consider not using them. And I say this jokingly, but the first and biggest problem that we have is it's a new technology area. Still, even though we're 10, 15-esque years into the making, we really still have very, very good cloud providers that have been through this, done that, and are innovative in a lot of ways on security, and we have a lot of them that are not. But it's really up to you, the customer, to really discern between the two, and that is not a healthy situation to be in a lot of cases. So a lot of what I do is have this conversation of what are the requirements that you do, or go to Cloud Security Alliance and read up some of the things that they have up there. But first and foremost, what is the content value of your transactions? What are the certification requirements, whether it's regulatory or industry oriented? And second, What are the liability requirements? So if that content was lost, stolen, or damaged, what is going to be the real impact to you? Roughly, I would say, historically, 80% of all impact is brand and reputation, but there are some financial impacts as a result of having a compromise. Do you know those? Are those aware? When we get to financial impacts under California law, you have a lot of breach notifications and having to pay for credit card watching reports sort of thing, which gets very, very expensive when you're in the hundreds of millions of customers' data that gets lost. And this could be a material effect. So as that materiality opposes, your 10K, 10Q is going to be noted, and it's going to be very public in a lot of different ways. Your auditors are now going to have to take a stronger look at your internal controls, and as a result of that, the culture could change. There could be very, very negative recourses. So having that conversation really well in advance is very, very important. Data center locations becomes significantly important, especially if you're international. I'm not saying that some of you might have German ties, but German privacy laws, as well as French privacy laws, or in general, the EU data protected effect is pretty significant. We also have the same thing in Singapore and a couple other areas, where there's a lot of fear, especially in government access of content, especially with Patriot Act in the US. So understanding and moving beyond that fear to the realities of what governments can and cannot do is very, very important, and more than happy to share information on that later. But also, what are the rules around the content that you have that you want to put up there, wherever it is, and what are the laws of the governing country in which you're residing in that requires it to be on-prem, or in location or not in location, is very, very important. You wouldn't want to find that out later on under a German data protection lawsuit. That becomes very, very problematic in a lot of ways. But having said that, I think it's critically and healthy to have that conversation with the cloud provider. Because one, the cloud provider's probably been through it 50 million times, can provide a significant amount of information in regards to how other customers have done it, how are we going to manage encryption, do we have the capability of allowing customer managing the keys of that encryption, so maybe there's some leeway in regards to the confidentiality of that content. Beyond that, how do we live with incidents? So if the cloud provider was compromised in some form or fashion, how is the working run book of that organization working with yours in order to deal with that incident? Or more importantly, if you had a security breach, how is the cloud provider going to work and help you through that process to understand maybe there was somebody attacking you and then as a result of that compromise the cloud provider? It's still your data and your content and your transactions. The cloud provider is an extension of you. If they are not behaving accordingly, and this is one tangible example, again, question dealing with that cloud provider. Beyond that, e-discovery or subpoenas, and there's two real realms of this, and we kind of touched on a little bit earlier in regards to FISA orders in the US. There's national intelligence letters, and the other side there is standard criminal warrants. Typically what you will have if a subpoena comes down is more of a philosophical decision, especially in the US, where the subpoena might be overreaching. It is asking for all content dealing with anybody within the US. That might be considered overreaching. If it's a valid request, the cloud provider will push back and say, no, I'm not going to service this. You need to narrow it down to whatever it needs to be. In addition, contractually, is that cloud provider going to notify you if they were served with a subpoena? There could be a lot of those stipulations. Is there going to be a delay within that notification of that subpoena? Is there going to be a delay in the providing of the content to law enforcement as a result of that? Are they going to push it to you to service and deal with that warrant? These are all things that should be part of the onboarding discussion, but become very, very real and very, very painful if you're not dealing with it contractually and you're living with it outside. Availability becomes very, very important, especially when you are moving to move yourself away from that cloud provider, or if that cloud provider decides to go bankrupt. I don't know if they can decide to go bankrupt, but maybe that's a possibility, or they decide to exit out of that service. They say, we're not going to perform that feature set anymore, so as a result of that, you need to have an exit plan. How are you going to migrate off of that service onto something else, or maybe you're going to build it out internally? This gets into a couple of hairy things. One, if it's a bankruptcy issue, what is the time of delay that they have in order to provide that content with you? Are you going to be wrapped up in legalities for the next 20 years as it goes through bankruptcy court? Do you have an ability to extract that yourself? Do you have the ability to extract the content in a format that you can actually use? Or is it proprietary of that cloud provider, and as a result of that, it's nearly useless to you? If it's encrypted, do you have access and storage of the keys? Are they in escrow? Can you actually access that escrow entity in order to get those keys, and therefore decrypt your content if need be? So there's a lot of considerations, and not just onboarding, not just the management, but also offboarding that become very, very important to figure out as you're thinking and working into cloud providers themselves.
So a question, if I'm signed up with Salesforce.com for that as a service, that would be my customer database as a service, so to speak.
Yes.
In that case, they are the cloud provider.
Yes.
And then if I sign up with, let's say, Marketo, a different company to do marketing automation, they would be the cloud provider for that. So if I think about using a different cloud provider for each business process, as Rich was kind of alluding to,
Yeah.
you could, I might end up with my company data residing in about 20 different cloud providers' places. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah, I would probably say it's not a possibility. You absolutely will.
Okay.
So think of it this way. Within any sort of enterprise, you have multiple applications. So you will at least, by common sense, have a one-to-one mapping to a cloud provider. Sky High Networks actually did a survey and an analysis part of going to customer, and their results were their typical potential customer would say, hey, we're using 10 cloud providers. In reality, it's somewhere around 700.
Wow.
So it's dramatically different than what's expected. So you have the shadow IT, whatever term you want to use. You have two individuals just trying to get something done, and they
Right.
decide to sign it up with a credit card. And then you have whole data centers of development environments and
Right.
Amazon that were completely unknown. So awareness and understanding is important. Second to that, you will absolutely have a smorgasbord, if you will, a grouping of cloud providers providing a service. The real secondary question really comes in is, how am I providing my basic controls and my monitoring, my supportability to that?
Right.
So a great example is identity and authentication. Do you really want to have J. Somaini at Salesforce with a password, J. Somaini at Amazon with a password? You really don't. It's a nightmare. So you want to leverage yet another. So we'll get into the Oktas of the world. Okta is a great service where it will interact and incorporate into all of the cloud providers that are out there, one ID, one password, and you can actually apply strong authentications and some capabilities to that. Beyond that, in each and every one of those cloud providers, you really need to consider their ability to be transparent, is what we call transparency. And part of that transparency is that if we are acting as an extension of every one of your environments, you would very rarely go to your own IT environment and say, hey, I'd really like to see the logs of that application. And they go, well, we can't provide it. Why should cloud providers be any different? Cloud providers should be providing basic logging over all transactions and activity around your content and transactions. This is something that is very rarely being done by most cloud providers. And the reason why I bring it up is, for security organizations in your enterprise, your content and transaction is not in your enterprise anymore. It's all over the place. And one of the basic things you need to do is monitor the activity. And if you're not able to get the logs from them, you're not able to monitor it, you're not able to see the malicious activity. Even if it's good people doing, probably not so bright things, you want to identify their mistakes and implement corrective actions. So really driving the cloud provider to provide logs into these services, whether it's your own internal SIM or if it's something like Sumo Logic or Splunk in the cloud, is critically critical.
Okay, great. Well, we're going to open up to general questions, but I'll just throw out one thought. If any of the panelists have a comment, it seems like from all of that IT department that used to be responsible for buying devices that no longer needs to be, it seems like there's a big role for that IT department to really understand all of this really, really well, and to be the one that is helping to make those selections and integrating and making sure all of this fits together. Is that fair to say from?
Absolutely. The role of CIOs is totally changing. In many cases, they learned a little bit about vendor management when they started outsourcing. Now they, as Justin just explained, need to know an enormous amount. And the role now becomes business partner with every one of your stakeholders in your company. I think what Rich talked about, where the first thing that Symantec moved to the cloud was development. That has to be a partnership with, in that case, 10, 12, 14 business unit leaders who were each having some unique need that had to be slightly different than the other line of business. And so even though they were all developing software, they had different common and different business needs. So you really need to, as a CIO, evolve into a new role. You have to become a partner with your legal department. The laws in every country, in every vertical market space are different, and they're evolving. Even if you look at the United States, every state has different laws. They're not all common. So as a CIO, you might not have gone to law school. You might have spent your time on technology. So now you must become a partner with your legal department as well. So I would agree with you. The role is changing.
I'd probably extend that. We talk about IT transformation, which is really the quote-unquote outsourcing, to simplify a term, and how CIOs and IT organizations have to go down a BMO-type path, vendor management path. What we're starting to see in the security space is not unlike that, which is the content transactions have moved out. We've been struggling at identifying how to secure those content transactions in third-party environments, and we've done crazy things like VPN through our enterprise and then hit the internet and we're going to secure you. But what I would say is we're on the very, very beginning cusp of a security transformation. We're now starting to see not only cloud providers coming to those coming forward, like Box, with those controls that we expect, but we're also seeing vendors see a marketplace and actually providing solutions where we actually need network stack protection, malware protection, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're in about the very beginning stages of maybe a 10 to 15-year arc, not unlike IT, where those security services are going to go to third parties to a fair degree. Vendor management is going to be a huge need. Risk management is going to be a huge discussion point and really driving it to the ground. And we're able to leverage and watch the pain points and needs of IT as it's been going through this as a lesson learned on how we can accelerate and maybe adapt and move forward a lot faster than maybe security has done in the past. And I'm sure everybody has dealt with a security organization that has been incredibly agile, fast. That was sarcasm. You might not be aware. Okay, fantastic. We're doing wonders here. This is great.
We have a question here.
Yeah, I do have a question for Justin. Justin, you see now already a lot of security issues are being resolved or being adapted. But as the IoT technology emerges, then what challenges you see?
In the what technology? The
IoT, Internet of Things, as they
emerge. Yeah, sorry. Ironically, I had this conversation the other day. I have a bit of a politician's disease, so I'm sorry. Give me the microphone and I don't shut up. But one of the things that I would say is there's one thing to receive signals from devices, right? You receive a signal from your refrigerator. It's a one-way direction. But when we start entering into two-way directions, I'm sending signals back to an engine. I'm able to upgrade the software of that engine. That's really when we start having a potential of very big problems. Okay. And we have not been very good as a technology community in the past 40, maybe 45 years in dealing with software security very well. We are incredibly bad at it. When you look at the deficiency rates of software, security software, whether it's security oriented or otherwise, it is pretty atrocious. And the basic metrics and how we tool a development community to be able to code properly. I really look back at the RACF, ACF2, and mainframe days of how they dealt with security, how they dealt with memory management, how they dealt with certain basic structures, as something that skill isn't really taught anymore. And so when I look at the Internet of Things, I think we need to be very careful, not at the concept, but very specifically at the developers that are coding the capability of Internet of Things, to make sure that we put in the control systems, the security, the awareness at an software application layer to make sure those tragedies won't happen. Because you're not going to be able to fix it by process, unfortunately, after the fact.
Yeah.
And that's probably the biggest thing. And those guys are definitely focused and thinking on this. I've had a couple of conversations with them. But I think that we've got some way to go.
Other questions for
Yes.
anyone on the panel?
We have one right back there.
I was just going to make a quick statement. I've been to 2 national conferences in the last 2 weeks, and I was flabbergasted, literally, at the naivete of the questions of the audience in the area of cybercrime in the cloud. I couldn't believe it. If you think you have a problem, call the FBI. They can handle everything. Or if you think you have a problem, call McAfee or Norton. They'll send somebody over and it'll all get fixed. The ridiculousness of that and the danger is tremendous. And of course, cybercrime is now being covered by separate insurance policies, and AIG, I know, is spending millions of dollars right now covering mistakes that never should have been made in the first place. It is a very serious matter. Cybercrime starts with the individual employee working innocently and should be going through somebody at the company that's checking everything that goes into the cloud before these things get utterly out of hand.
Yeah, now I would say one of the biggest struggles that the heads of security have in implementing security within an enterprise is not a technical one, but it's a behavioral one. I mean, that's unfortunately one of the areas that is very commonly overlooked. So the question isn't about just telling them what they should do, is how you emotionally enroll them so that they know, they practice, they believe in it every single day. So what we do is we send them to an hour training every year and, hey, you've been warned, sort of aspect. But we don't have, not to use a marketing term, but we don't have a drip campaign. We don't have an elongated lead gen kind of capability of each and every week. We have an asset, we have a data point, we have a touch point to that employee to really say, here's something that you should know, so it starts to get worked into who they are. We don't attach it, quite honestly. Very rarely do we attach basic security goals or objectives into the line management of the business. People will do what their paychecks kind of drive them, and they will adopt behaviors. As their manager, their first manager, starts to create that micro culture. If we don't start driving security into that first line management, how can the individual employee survive? And these are a lot of the things, and I can talk about ad nauseum, but see, these are some of the things that you really need to implement in most security organizations because, again, it's culture change, and that's a difficult thing to do in anybody's book.
So over here first.
So just on that point, so what you're saying is that in regards to cyber crime, it may not be an issue so much with the software or everything else, but the actual person that's in charge of inputting it?
Well,
I work in retail, and so with the big cyber theft at Target, and they trace that back as actually being an employee with the security company that may have been compromised.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different things and reasons why failure can exist. But one of the common core ways of defending against that is to have an intelligent, curious, and critical employee at every phase. So let me use a different example. We want to put in security into a change management process within a company in IT. So anytime somebody's going to do a configure change, it needs to be reviewed, a firewall change, a software update, et cetera, whatever it is this going to cause us risk, harm, or problems? That's a very common thing to do. Security team comes in, works in that process, and maintains that. What you really want to do is not only to go in as a security person to implement those controls or those questions and those decision points, but really to train and educate the other project managers that actually own that process. I will never have enough people. I will never have enough money. My job isn't to own everything. My job is to identify the problems, jump in, solidify, and then slowly back off where I can leave a more educated or resilient individual that they're going to identify the problems and come to me for, say, level 3 support. Now, there's no question there's advanced attacks out there that will attack operating systems that are very complex, that are even more challenging to some of the most advanced security researchers that are out there. That is the world that we're in today. But when you look at the vast majority of issues and problems, it's human error. It's good people making mistakes. It's, you know, a malicious individual where the manager knew about it but didn't say anything. Where they said, I know this person's going to leave, etc., but didn't say anything to somebody else. It's basic human nature to deal with a vast majority of issues that are out there.
Yes.
Yeah, a lot of what's been discussed touches upon medium to large enterprise issues. If you go down into small, medium size, you're not going to have a data center, right, inside your company. You're making a choice usually of having an on-prem server of some kind, or going to the cloud with a server. And someone who's new to those kind of issues, a business owner or an executive in a 20 to 50, even 100 employee company, may not have thought about the issues of how easy it is to intrude your system if you have an on-premises server versus in some kind of Fort Knox-like data center that has teams of legions of security people making sure that at least the facility physically is secure. And so clients that we have that are law firms, security firms, like small size, they've had to wrestle with these issues. Do we keep our data on, inside our facility? What kind of guards, what kind of security do you have in this building or this office? Usually a small company can't have that. And in a properly placed cloud environment, they can have.
So it could be a good argument that it's going to be a lot safer for that company to put everything in the cloud, because that way they're actually paying for the service of taking care of their data.
But not a law firm. Law firms have, no, I'm serious, because law firms have their own problems. They have attorney-client privilege, they have an expectation of privacy, and if you put it up in a cloud server, some of that expectation of privacy goes away because you don't control the data. And so there are some concerns there are some legal boundaries on some things you have to do your work on for law firms especially.
That
Very good point.
That certainly brings up the idea of hybrid cloud, where you might have it private inside your firewall versus an external.
We're about to get fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now we have quite a bit of buzz about something like that, where even a law firm might put their HR data out on the cloud, but keep their client data private, either on-prem or in a private cloud.
Same with HIPAA with
Yeah, exactly.
That's not as much.
Yeah.
So I would actually contest that a little bit. Like I was saying before, there are some good cloud providers out there, and there are some not so good cloud providers out there. The ones that are good can meet the regulatory privacy confidentiality needs that are out there. I'm more than happy to talk about Box at some later date. That's really not the venue here, but there are ones that are out there to really facilitate that. The problem that we have in a lot of law firms, as well as in other organizations, is that lawyers are not any different than researchers in pharmaceutical organizations or professors in universities. They are very intelligent individuals that will just go off and do something unto themselves to a great degree and not truly understand the ramifications. So the vast majority of legal entity conversations that I have is when they have identified a problem and are coming to us because they are using a sync and file sharing solution that is incredibly insecure. And then they're just astonished about what we can do. The same thing could be said in other services. Salesforce actually does a lot of really good things. And Okta and et cetera, there are a lot of good companies that are out there. But I do think that you bring up a very good point. Let's take HIPAA as an example. So you can encrypt it at rest, but do you have the controls to ensure that the device that's accessing that account, that's about to download that content, has been verified and encrypted? With certain services you can, but you can't do them with all. If you have a integration with your system, are there open APIs on that platform, an ability to not necessarily go to a web page, but I have my internal service, whether it's my IT command and control service, automatically connected to that application platform programmatically to identify and validate every transaction and send me alert within my enterprise. You can do that. But going back to your point in regards to small entities, the cloud is a massive disruptor, not necessarily for small organizations, but for larger ones, because they can't compete as fast as smaller organizations as they move quickly to the cloud, become more agile, and can compete so much faster than larger entities. As a result of that, they also get an uplift. And I'll just use one example. So if we look at cloud as a centralization of content, such as we're able to take all of our distributed content on laptops, USBs, floppies, and re-centralize that, I can apply those basic premises of security, confidentiality, integrity, and availability to it. I cannot apply them on a USB stick, or as I send off in an email with an attachment to it. So there are some capabilities where the cloud utility, by the use of the technology itself, dramatically uplifts the security of the service. And that's not an on-prem, off-prem thing. That is just the use of a centralized utility, getting us back to more of a mainframe-esque kind of model. All right, again, politicians.
Which kind of comes full circle, and as we think about some of these human aspects, remember some of the human parts that are driving this is the individual wanting to use their own device, wanting to do it their own way. So despite whatever kind of security that may be in place, the reality is Sally Sue is going to take her iPad and she's going to go home and she's going to use her Gmail or her Dropbox to send her file to her sister, who's going to put it on a USB, etc. So there's always this human aspect that's going to go around that. Yeah.
I guess I'm just curious if you can talk about whether, as a sector cloud service providers, whether there is a trade association where people can provide certification, and there's a centralized source people can go to and figure out which ones are more stringent, in terms of
I would take a look at the Cloud Security Alliance. They're probably, one of the really focused within that. I know that ISO, the International Standards Organization, is going down a cloud path. CSA, as well with ISO, is working on crafting out a couple of things for that specifically. I think that's probably the best way. Common mechanisms for cloud providers to communicate out their health. There's an ISO certification. You have SOC 1, SOC 2, your SSAE 16 certifications, and then regulatory ones like PCI, HIPAA, etc.
There was a question in the back, yes.
It was more of a comment. I think the other thing is, from maybe security, there's also the business model, right? So it doesn't really hit the enterprise standpoint, but if you look at, for example, Facebook, and their business model is about making the data, distributing that out, right, to getting it, and so I think there's maybe to some level looking at a company, what they're trying to do, how they're trying to make money, and just you can be educated yourself and just say, okay, clearly this is a company based on their business model that's trying to maybe not keep myself the most secure.
That's a good point. In making that choice, look at where and how do they make money, and where might they be going? Are they gathering your data in order to sell it to others in order to market? Yeah.
I have a question. Rich, you spoke to many companies being on cloud companies being on a subscription model. I'd be interested how the transition for a company who did use perpetual licensing, how they transition to subscription model, because my sense is that the implications there for revenue, for balance sheet, can be actually quite dramatic.
They can be. The reality, though, from an accounting standpoint, it's really more of a cash transaction, right? Because when you buy a big license, I mean, especially when you're dealing with Oracle or Microsoft, you're spending a lot of money up front for that license. But from an earnings standpoint, you're basically taking that license and you're amortizing it over 3, 5, sometimes 7 years.
Yeah.
So it hits the books in terms of the operating expense as if it's a subscription.
Yeah.
So the reality is, financially, it's not as big a change as most people think, although it is an enormous benefit to cash flow. Now on the reverse side, because when I was working at Symantec, we used to prefer to sell licenses, right?
Yeah.
But then we had to move to a subscription model. So when we moved to a subscription model, we found that the cash coming in the door was not nearly as great as it used to be when we were selling licenses, right? So, I mean, again, you have to be, when you're talking about the cloud, you have to think, are you a consumer or are you a provider,
Yeah.
right? And certainly there is a change in cash flow.
Yeah, and I should probably could speak to the provider side, because I think some discussion goes around why are, for example, SAP and Oracle not moving more decisively to SaaS, because for that very reason, not to disappoint Wall Street, how to incent their sales force.
Yeah, so for example, in our work with Adobe was a case where, I mean, if you look at Creative Suites, Photoshop, InDesign, all of that, I mean, it was $3,000 upfront a company would spend. And once you bought that perpetual license, you could use it forever. The challenge that Adobe found was, number one, their users needed more features more quickly than buying it and then wait a year, 2 years, so it's upgraded. So that was one of the key drivers, was needing to be able to feed features quickly and easily to their users, which you can get with cloud, and as a service, you're always in communication with your user base. The second was, in Adobe's case, cash flow did play into it, because if they came out with, let's say, Creative Suites 4, historically about 70% of their users would upgrade in the first year. So when they came out with it, their users might upgrade for $2,000. So they had a big spike in revenue when it first came out. But then nobody upgraded until the next big release, so their cash flow would go down. And then the next big release, it would go up. And if they missed one of those releases, or one of those releases didn't take off, it would go down again. So the need to have predictability of your revenue, a monthly recurring revenue that is predictable, because you have these subscribers that have signed up for a year, was another key driver for Adobe. Now, if you think about it though, you've got people that are paying $3,000 to buy the license, and suddenly instead you can subscribe for a month for $50. That's a cash flow challenge. And that's where a lot of strategic decisions need to be made on how to do that. Number one, you wouldn't do that overnight for everybody, but maybe start with a new untapped market that you haven't been selling the $3,000 to these people anyway. Let's sell a lot of $50 ones here. Get that going, and then we go to a next market, then we go to a next market. So doing it strategically, as well as building in customer demand and incentives and a lot of other things that we could talk about. But it's not an easy overnight equation, because there is a lot that goes into it. As a data point, in the 4 years since that decision to now, the Adobe stock has increased about 200%. If you go online and look at Adobe stock from 2010 to today, you'll see a very strong trajectory.
So Jennifer, if I could just echo that. I mean, from a predictability standpoint, from a finance perspective, you are right on. Financial guys love that predictability of the subscription-based revenue coming in. Now, there's a little heartache getting over that first loss in revenue or cash flow, right? But that's a very short, generally, short in duration. And then you get on the subscription model, and that is much preferred by financial types. Much better predictability.
And I think the important part of the message is address your business processes, and don't forget your users, not just your customers, but also your partners and also your employees. So they're prepared, and they are adjusting and adapting, bought into the changes that you're going to make. Because as all of this, it isn't just technology. It really is about the people involved. And that's probably the most critical thing, whether it's security or financials or new businesses. It's really the people that you have to consider and work that through well ahead of changing technologies.
So the cloud can do a lot for each of us, but it's not overnight. And as Sophia very clearly said, the people are the important part. So we will be around to take other questions as long as we want to go. I know that we'd said by 1:30 and one that needs to leave can certainly do so. There are little cards on the chairs. If you don't mind, we would love to get some feedback. I mean, there's a lot of different areas we could delve into on this topic, and so we're very, very open to other suggestions around this or other kinds of topics.